You're listening to The Occupational Philosophers with Simon Banks and John Rice.
And welcome to another episode of The Occupational Philosophers, a not-so-serious business podcast to spark creativity, curiosity and imagination, and hopefully spark a little smile on the way, because really the world is serious enough as it is. And look, it's a little Inbetweeners episode today, John, so we'll keep it short and sharp and a little bit more succinct than my often long ramblings, which I'm giving an example of now. So, John, over to you. I can see you rolling your eyes.
That's like half the episode already.
And thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for joining.
But John, what are we going to talk about today?
We're going to talk about questions, Simon, because questions, as you say, are at the heart of occupational philosophy. And so I wanted to look at how questions can achieve different aims. There's always a purpose to a question, and I just wanted to explore that. So let me give you an example. So if we're sat in a conversation and you're telling me about how you're going to go about a project or something like that, I'm going to put it in the work context. I might ask a question where I'm trying to get clarity. So I might say, tell me more about that. What do you mean? Can you explain that a bit more to me? And so my purpose in asking that question is to get more information from you. So that's at its simplest. That's just a useful question for me to get more knowledge. But then I can ask another question. I go, why is it you want to do it that way? So I might challenge it. Is that the right way to go about it in this situation? So I'm challenging you then with a question. So I've listened and then I start to challenge. So it goes a little deeper.
And I think the intent of this, if we're leaning into it, I'm thinking, it's about how can I be a little bit more curious, or a lot more curious about what's behind you. And I'm going to jump in early. I think ask with a curious intent as well. Like I think the way these questions can be framed, or the tone of your voice, makes a big difference, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So we always talk about be careful with asking a question that begins with why. And why are you doing it like that? Well, you might not say it in that tone, but yes, why sometimes feels a bit confrontational. So you might ask, what are the options here? And what makes that option the best route forward, for example? So you can absolutely think about the language you use as you seek to challenge someone. So we can get clarity, we can challenge, we can examine someone's understanding. So we can say, look, how do you know this stuff? How do you know that this is the route forward? Tell us what information you've got and brought in to your decision making. So again, we're starting to find out a bit more about how someone's coming to a decision, for example. So we can examine, we can get clarity, we can challenge, we can examine someone's idea and where they get their information from. We can just straight up ask for their perspective and set it against another perspective. So we can get a perspective from them and then say, how does that perspective stack up against this perspective or viewpoint over here? And what makes this one better than the other? So we can draw out perspectives and recognize that outside of facts, we're looking at viewpoints. And then a key one is impact. Often when we're chatting about an idea or a project or something like that in the workplace, we could say, and how will this affect ... So how will this affect us as a team? How will this impact the client? How will this impact the business, etc.? And so it's just having people starting to ask a question that almost has them look up and consider the impact of what they might be thinking about and talking about and looking to do in the wider ecosystem they operate in.
Yeah, and I heard this saying, raise your gaze this week. So raise your gaze. So look up and look around. What's the ecosystem? What are some of those different systems which might be interacting? And so I like that one. Raise your gaze. Raise your gaze.
Raise your gaze. There's another hashtag and a T-shirt. Then there's meta questioning, which is almost the questions about the questions you're asking. And I actually do this sometimes with teams and just say, look, what are the questions that are burning in your mind? What are the questions you think really need to be answered? And then you come above it and go, why? Why are you asking these questions? And that takes you just another level as to understanding then the purpose behind the question and having someone think about the purpose behind the question. So why are you asking this question is a question about their question, if that makes sense, without starting to fry our brains.
No, this is good. And I think we've spoken about before that the 5 whys, which comes from the world of Toyota manufacturing, Sakichi Toyoda, who's the inventor of this technique, I believe, and just keep asking why. So, if you state your problem, keep asking, why? Why? And then so every time you get an answer, you ask, well, why is that the case? So you can drill down a lot further. I really like those, John. I think it comes from that if you come in with a curious mindset, realize there's almost, before you ask your next question, you can almost pause and be thinking, what's the right question to be asking here, rather than blurting that out. So it's almost that stimulus gap response, isn't it?
It is. That's a really good catch, because I think that's right. Because when we say, be curious, ask questions, of course, the quality of questions is everything.
Yeah.
And so I think it starts with, as you say, pausing and saying, what do I need here? What's the question that's going to serve that purpose? I need more information. Okay, well, let me go and ask a question that draws that out. Or I need to understand the impact here. Okay, we'll ask a question that's going to draw that out. And I think sometimes, again, in one-to-one conversations, but team conversations, all of these things kind of weave and become a great mess, and they kind of get lost. Sometimes you're talking about impact and then you're going back to facts that are needed. And I do think there's something about getting some sort of order to this and going, let's gather in all the information. Let's then have questions that consider the impact. Let's then have questions that go out and get all the perspectives on this, and some sort of order around that, or method to that, I think can be quite useful sometimes, particularly when there's real huge complexity at play. And let's face it, often there is.
Not often, I say always there is. If problems were easy to solve, they'd be solved. You know what I mean? It comes back to this. Let's say you're walking out on the street and you see some rubbish on the ground, and you go, okay, I'm going to pick up that rubbish. Okay. Problem solved. We've solved that. Okay. We don't really have to ask a question. The next day there's some rubbish, and you go, all right, I'll pick it up again. If there's rubbish in the same spot every day for a week, then you need to be asking, well, why is this happening? This is a more complex problem that needs a more complex or a different type of solution as well. And those great questions are a way to get into that space.
Yes, that's it. Let's get into the why. And remember that if you're sat in a room and the best question you've got is what time's lunch, you're in the wrong room. You need better questions.
Reflecting on that, I've been doing a lot of stuff at the front of a room lately. And what I realize is I'll ask something and the audience will be looking at me like, what? And I'll say to them, I think I need to rephrase the questions. So we don't always ask the best questions, but if you ask a good question, you'll get a good, you won't, what's the right way? You won't necessarily get a good response, but you get a curious response. So a curious question will get a curious response. There'll be some good content in it. So just reflect on yourself. Are you asking the right questions? And also be open and saying, I think I've asked the wrong question. Let me rephrase that. And then I think it's also, we go into that, I don't know, vulnerability, trust, all that type of stuff. I think it's a bit of fun if you can say, I think I've asked the wrong question.
And the final one there is sometimes you can declare the intent of the question. So, look, I just want to get some more clarity here. And then you ask your question. Or I just want to understand the impact of this action. And then you ask your question. And sometimes highlighting the intent and the purpose and then asking your question helps people as well. Helps people understand it.
Phrase that at the beginning, I'm really curious about, because curiosity brings like a sense of amazement, a sense of wonder. So you lean in rather than saying, I want to work out why this is so shit. You don't understand. I'm really curious to understand the thoughts behind this and the ideas. So I think the way you lean in to that is important as well.
And that's great, to say that I'm really curious as to why this is such a shit idea, I think.
So look, on that, John, I think that's a nice little note to wrap us up. So I think be curious, loads of different types of questions. You can even have a framework, have a piece of intent. And I think, John, yeah, sure.
And I'm curious what people are going to make of this episode.
Maybe this isn't the one for the ratings, but we'll, I think though, in the show notes, we'll put those notes there, John, just around those different types of questions. I think it'd be a nice little piece to wrap up. So, John, that brings
in the meantime. In the meantime,
just wrap this up.
So in the meantime, stay curious, make stuff, play more, have fun, and date life.
And ask questions.